25. Dragon. The word came from the ancient Greek drakon, for serpent, a word that itself came from even further back in Indo-European family, where it held meaning such as to see, bright, and light. As for why the word for to see evolved into dragon, it was apparently because dragon meant something with a deadly gaze. It didn't make much sense to me when I read this on the internet in elementary school, but now, years later, I finally had the chance to experience what it was those ancients were so afraid of.
Here comes the gaze. Everyone under level 20, look down!
I shouted. Two blood-red eyes flashed at the other end of the huge hall. It was just a light, neither hot nor cold, but an unpleasant, freezing sensation raced up my back and prickled my skin all over. A number of players who ignored my warning and looked into the light froze up, affected by a stun effect. The sources of light were two eyes with crimson irises and vertical slit pupils. The eyes of the 7th floor boss of Aincrad, Aguilar, the igneous worm. As I'd expected, Aguilar was greatly strengthened since the beta test. One of the new features was the menacing gaze it emitted. It started by widening its wings, then flashing its eyes. If you looked into the light, any player under level 20 was immediately stunned. Asa and I cleared that hurdle, but the recommended level for the 7th floor, if you accounted for a healthy safety margin, was only level 17, and most of the group was around there. Aside from us, the only level 20s were probably Lind, Cabal, Agile, Argo, and then Kismel and Keo. If SAO wasn't a deadly game, you'd probably be able to finish the 7th floor at around level 10, with a lot of luck and ingenuity, and a good 5 or 10 deaths. So it was asking a lot to expect people to be at level 20 already. But of course, the boss wasn't going to be easy on us. In the back of the chamber, the massive dragon curved its long neck into an S shape. Wings folded, sparks began to spill from the edges of its closed jaw.
Here comes the breath! Tanks, prioritize whoever's stunned!
I shouted again, and the 6 parties that made up our raid, teams A, B, and C, made up of the DKB, and D, E, and F from the ALS, gathered together with the shield-bearing player taking positions up front. I was the leader of Team G, and Agile was the head of Team H. But because neither of our two teams had any shield users, we quickly retreated and hid behind the other parties. Aguilar's neck shot forward like a whip, and it opened its mouth wide. Vroom! The air trembled. Orange flames that emerged fanned outward, covering the long and narrow chamber. As the flame breath hit the tank shields, there was an explosive roar, and the fire billowed upward, causing the experienced and talented front runners to shriek. Aguilar wasn't the first boss to use a breath attack, but there was something about dragonfire that stirred primeval fears. And unlike direct attacks, fire could still snake around the sides of the shield blocking it. If a 6-person party bunched together as close as possible, they could all just barely fit behind a great shield. But standing farther back, we still had to deal with the secondary wave of the flames.
Let's go, right here!
Asuna, Argo, and I had Keo and Ninir surrounded, and on Kismel's instruction, we used single-hit sword skills to the left and right against empty air. 4 different attack vectors cut through the onrushing flames, neutralizing it. There was still a major cloud of sparks, however, and I couldn't help but swear, "Ouch!" The reason that swearing was the worst I had dealt with was thanks to an icon below my HP bar, featuring a shield and flames. A flame-resistant buff was extremely valuable in SAO, and we had that thanks to Argo, who pulled out all of the snow tree buds in her inventory and sprinkled the entire raid party with their ice water. If not for that, each bout of flame breath, even if blocked by a shield and sword, would have taken a good 10% of our HP. To our right, the Bro Squad was utilizing a similar tactic, except that it was one person using a wider two-handed sword skill, with the other three ducking behind him to escape the brunt of the fire. Watching them almost made me want to try out the two-handed sword skills. The rolling wave of flames passed by us and died out. Up front, a voice barked out sharp orders.
A and C, move up and strike its leg. D and F, take the right. And B and E, pull back and heal. G and H, strike from the sides.
At those words from Lind, the scimitar brandishing leader of the DKB, a few dozen players roared and charged. He'd been elected primary leader of the raid on a coin toss, and it was perhaps a sign of how crucial this fight was that the ALS Cabal was following those orders without comment. Asana and I were usually treated as miscellaneous members during boss battles, but since we were offering special rewards this time, we were allowed to give orders to the raid as special supervisors. I told them I would give the guild flag or the Sword of Volupta to whichever guild helped more, which was intentionally vague and undefined because I wanted to avoid a simple competition to inflict more damage. And that instruction had brought us to this unexpected bonus honor. But for now, I was only speaking up to warn about the boss's special moves. Lind was doing fine ordering the group's attacks, and honestly, when it came to keeping tabs on the HP levels of each party and moving them forward and back, he was a better leader than I was. Despite their bickering, Lind and Cabal were both proving themselves to be good learners. The attackers surged towards Aguilar's front feet and began to hack at the beast while it was slowed after the breath attack. Aguilar was over 30 feet long, and its head was 12 feet off the ground in a normal stance. So, the usual strategy against monsters of this size was to attack their feet and get them to lower their heads. That was how we'd beaten Aguilar in the beta, in fact. Our teams weren't just standing around either. We followed the leader's orders. The four of us, aside from Kyo, carrying Nanir, racing at full speed towards the left side of Aguilar, from our perspective, and slamming our sword skills into the beast's unguarded flank. 2 or 3 seconds later, the Bro Squad's giant axes and hammers were smashing at the right side of the boss. In our second group's attack, we eliminated the first of Aguilar's 6 HP bars. The irrational cube from the 6th floor only had a single bar, so 6 seemed like an endless slog. But this boss didn't have any complex puzzle gimmicks like that cube did, and the dragon's defense wasn't boosted up as high as I feared. If we could take out one whole HP bar in 2 rounds of offense, that meant 10 more attack chances to finish the other 5 bars. Not that it's going to be that simple, I thought. Just as Aguilar recovered from its sluggishness and emitted a metallic roar.
Arm attack! Left!
The DKB attackers around the left front leg, the right leg from Aguilar's perspective, quickly retreated. The arm lifted high into the air and slammed into the ground like a piece of heavy demolition equipment, creating huge cracks in the ground. Nobody was hit directly, but 3 or 4 of them were swallowed up by shockwaves that were impossible to avoid, losing about 20% HP.
Now comes the right,
I continued, and it was the ALS's turn to back away. A ferocious rumble shook the entire boss chamber. The hit could be fatal if inflicted directly, but it was such a slow and obvious attack that nobody talented and dedicated enough to be a raid party melee fighter could fail to dodge it. While it swung its arms, Team G and H continued to attack its sides, grinding down over a third of the second HP bar. The DPS numbers for Asuna and Argo and the Bro Squad were top of the class among the group, but it was Kismel's attack power that was truly outrageous. Even with a replacement weapon, her single attack sword skills inflicted as much damage as 2-part two-handed skills. But it's too dangerous to get greedy, I reminded myself, right as Lind cried,
"Everyone withdrawal!"
He must have caught some lead-in movement of the dragon's head, which I couldn't see from my position. We rushed straight for the rear of the chamber, the sound of myriad scales sliding and scraping behind us. I glanced over my shoulder as I ran and caught a sight of Aguilar's huge body curled into a C-shape. Then, a tail like a tree trunk swung forth and pulverized stone walls to the left and right. Dust clouded the area, hiding the dragon's body. An omnidirectional tail attack was something new since the beta. The first time it used it in the fight, it caught 3 people, taking 70% of their health in one hit. With everyone safely out of range, Lind gave the order for the damaged parties to switch with the parties who had been staying back and recovering with potions. Next would be another menacing gaze, followed by another breath attack, I guessed. As long as we avoided the gaze, we could deal with the flame breath. At this rate, we might not even need to use that sword, Asuna whispered. I glanced over at the sword of Eventide in my right hand. She was referring to the sword of Volupta, the weapon we'd gone to such lengths to gain in order to motivate the DKB and ALS, and to use as an ace up our sleeve against Aguilar. But it was still in my inventory. It was registered to my quick change setting, but I didn't want to equip it if possible. That was because earlier in the labyrinth, Q had explained the downside behind those broken specs, and they were worse than I could have imagined. As for Kyo, she was still carrying Ninir strapped to her back. We tried to convince her to wait outside the boss chamber with her mistress, but she insisted, and we had to give in and allow her to come with us. But with the boss's attacks demanding more dynamic forward and backward movement, and her burden leaving her unable to sprint, Kyo was having trouble taking part in any of the offense. She recognized her struggle too, and gripped her estoc with obvious frustration. "I'm sorry. I was hoping I would prove to be useful." "Don't worry. Your job is to protect Lady Nier," I replied, at once, patting the maid's arm. "If you waited outside the chamber, there was a possibility that several powerful monsters could have spawned all at once. As long as you stay near the door, none of the attacks will reach you aside from the flame breath, and we'll be there to protect you from that. Our goal isn't to defeat the dragon, but to save Ninir's life with its blood, right?" Said, speaking as fast as I could to save time. Kyo looked at me in the face and bobbed her head. Up ahead, Lind shouted,
"Here comes the gaze!"
Through the clearing haze of dust, I could see Aguilar's wings stretching wide. It seemed that the boss's attack pattern was fixed. Gaze, flame breath, front leg attack, tail attack. As long as you dealt with the gaze and the tail attack properly, we could push all the way through the 5th HP bar. It might change up its style on the last bar, like some previous bosses, but as long as we kept everyone's HP up, we should be able to withstand its near-death frantic mode. I squeezed the hilt of my trusty sword and glared back into the crimson glow of Aguilar's eyes. "Do your worst, you scaly bastard!" From that point forward, the battle played out largely as I expected. When we reached the 4th HP bar, meaning we'd finished off half of its health reserve, Aguilar threw in a curveball by blowing fire 3 times consecutively, causing the majority of the frontline fighters to lose over 30% HP. But Lind and Cabao deftly worked the groups into a healing rotation, and we were able to recover. From that point on, the regular patter resumed, and we took down the 4th bar, then the 5th. 40 minutes after the battle began, we reached the 6th and final HP bar of Aguilar, the Igneous Worm.
Watch out for different attack patterns. Focus on guarding until you receive orders to attack,
Lind called out. The raid party turtled up on defense. With the tanks at the front, Agile's team and ours held weapons up to block whatever unknown attack came next. Aguilar growled in the very back of the chamber, low and long. It was deeper than its previous utterances, which put me in mind of a rage like oil threatening to ignite and explode. The walls and floor were shattered all over from dozens of impact from arms and tail, and pieces of rubble littered on the ground. In fact, the buildup of obstacles had made it harder to approach the dragon's flank, but pretty soon, I suspected, we'd be able to disable its legs. If its head fell down to the floor, we should be able to press a full attack that would take out the last bar. Suddenly, Aguilar's growling stopped. The wings spread to the sides.
The gaze! It might be powered up. Everyone, look down, including level 20 and up,
Lind shouted. I recognized his logic and gave up on staring it back, looking at my feet instead. Asuna and Kismel did the same on either side of me. The gaze effect activated about 3 seconds after the wing moved. I counted down the seconds in my head. 1, 2...
No, it's not!
Shouted Argo, the first to notice. There was a flapping sound. I looked up to see Aguilar floating towards the ceiling, beating its wings powerfully. Even in the beta, Aguilar had never flown. No boss monster had, in fact. Fuscus, the vacant colossus from the 5th floor, had its face stuck to the ceiling of the chamber, and the irrational cube from the 6th floor had floated 10 feet high above the ground, but neither of them were really flying. Neither I nor anyone else in the raid knew what to do in the moment, so we froze.
Hey, he's flying! What's the plan, Lind?
Cabao demanded at last, but Lind was still stuck in place. Even I couldn't tell what the best course of action would be yet. Aguilar rose nearly 40 feet to the ceiling in a blink, and then its eyes flashed red. The gaze attack! Screams erupted from all over the chamber. Everyone in the raid party looked the dragon full in the eyes. Everyone under level 20, which was 90% of the group, was going to fall to the floor, stunned. A stun was different from paralysis and only lasted about 3 seconds. But 3 seconds was an agonizing lifetime right now, because Aguilar was most likely about to...
It's going to breathe fire!
Kismel shouted, just as it opened its massive jaws and belched a mass of solid flames. Unlike the previous breath attack, which fanned outward, this was a fireball about 3 feet across. A curtain of sparks sprayed from the sphere as it hurtled towards the center of the chamber. That was no simple ball-shaped mass of fire.
Protect Ninir!
I shouted, covering Kyo from behind where she stood in shock. Kismel, Asuna, and Argo followed me, pressing in. Just get through this, everyone, I willed to my fellow raid members, preparing for the shock. Half a second later, the ball made contact with the floor and caused a mammoth explosion. First came the shockwave, then a wall of red flames. A split second later, clumped up together, we did our best to hold our ground, but it was impossible to withstand. We were tossed backward, as though slapped by a giant hand, and flew directly into the wall. Ugh! It felt like my body was going to be shattered to pieces. I willed my eyes to stay open, so I could focus on not my HP bar, but Ninir. There had only been 10% left, and the damage of the impact instantly gouged away more, putting her under 5%. We avoided instant death, but that was only because Kyo was able to turn her body to take the brunt of the impact herself just before hitting the wall. In fact, she'd taken so much damage that she went all the way down to 30%, and an unconscious icon appeared. Asuna's HP was at 60%, Argo's was at 50%, Kismel and I were at 70%. A heavy rumble passed through the floor. Aguilar had concluded its hovering and landed in the center of the floor. The shockwave of the explosion slammed nearly every stunned raid member against the wall, where they collapsed on top of each other. After a quick check of our HP list on the left side of my vision, I could see that no one had died instantly, but everyone was wounded, many of them only 20 or 30% remaining. Aguilar roared triumphantly in the center of the room. It curved its neck to look at where Lind and Team A were collapsed. All of them were deeply wounded. A single swipe from the dragon's claws would finish them off. Ugh, I groaned, trying to get to my feet, when I heard a faint voice.
Kirito, stand me up.
I looked to my right, feeling the breath catch in my throat. Behind Kyo's back, where she slumped unconscious against the wall, Ninir's eyes were open, just slightly, staring at me. Up close, the crimson irises pierced my own. Hurry. Her voice was a barely audible rasp, but there was a stately command to it that was impossible to refuse. I nodded, then used my sword to cut the straps holding her down, circling my free hand around her tiny body so we could stand together. The others were recovering from the shock of the impact and were looking at us in stunned silence. Ninir left my arm to stand on her own, faltering slightly. She undid the clasp of the cloak and let it fall to the floor. Her long golden hair danced in the gusting, swirling aftermath the explosion had left behind. In the distance, the fire dragon was taking step after step toward Lin's group. It was barely 10 yards away from them.
Kirito, give me Falhari's sword,
Ninir said, reaching toward me. Deep in my heart, I knew this was coming. There was no other way out of this harrowing disaster in the making. But Ninir only had 5% of her HP remaining. And because she had awoken from the comatose state the lobelia flower poison caused, the continual damage of the silver poisoning had resumed. She surely had less than a minute before it was all over. Feeling like my insides were being torn to pieces, I opened my window and pressed the quick change button. The sword of Eventide was wreathed in a white effect and vanished, replaced by the sword of Volupta, a long sword of platinum and gold. I held it out by the hilt and set the handle in Ninir's hands. Her little fingers curled around the red leather of the grip. Immediately, the white jewel set into the pommel shone crimson, and an invisible energy pushed back against my hand, causing me to stumble a few steps back. Ninir's blonde hair and black summer dress began to swell and swirl in a sudden gust of wind that arose, spiraling from the floor. The crimson light moved up the golden ridge of the flat of the blade and lit it up just as brightly. The blade, which looked like platinum silver, turned a partially translucent black, like guilt melting and evaporating. Yet the sword could not possibly have been made of silver. Only a lord of night could draw out its true power. It was a vampire's weapon. The moment the sword's tip took on its true color, the crimson flashed even brighter on the pommel and ridge. Aguilar, sensing something was happening, stopped moving forward and swiveled its head around to look this way. Ninir promptly pulled back the shining red sword with both hands and swung it forward with a piercing cry. The scarlet blade of energy cut through the stone floor ahead of her and flew onward with shocking speed toward Aguilar. But just before it split the beast's scaly snout, the fire dragon leapt sideways with uncommon agility for its size. The slash passed it with a heavy zoom, but severed Aguilar's left arm and wing at the root. The 6th HP bar drained. It hit 70%, 60, 50, and then stopped. I failed, Ninir whispered. The sword of Volupta slid from her hand and made a strange sound as it fell to the floor. Her little body slumped over like a puppet, with no one controlling its strings. I held out my hands to support her. She had 3% of her HP remaining. Ninir! I went down to a knee and cradled her head. Her closed lids fluttered and opened very slightly.
Please, Kirito, take Kyo and run.
Ninir,
don't bother with me. At least save Kyo.
The girl rasped, the light in her crimson eyes wavering, flickering, then pooling in small droplets. Her remaining HP was 2%. In the distance, Aguilar was roaring with fury. But I paid the dragon no heed. In my mind was busy racing. How to save Ninir, Kyo, the girls, and all the other players here. There had to be a way. Had to.
Please.
Ninir's voice was nothing but exhaled air now. Behind her thin lips gleamed white teeth. No, fangs. Suddenly, I realized the only option I could take. Ninir, drink my blood. The dying girl's eyes opened just a bit more. Her HP amount was down to 1%.
No. If I do that, you will.
I don't care. It's the only way. I'm not going to regret it. So please, take my blood. I stared into her eyes from just inches away, pleading with her, then lifted her head and pressed her mouth to the side of my neck. Her lips trembled against my skin with deep hesitation and distress, but then they opened wider, and 2 sharp fangs pierced deep into my neck. There was no sense of pain in SAO, A sword could chop off one of your hands or feet, and all you'd feel was an unpleasant numbness. But strangely enough, just this once, I felt a sensation of pain, purely honed, colder than ice, and yet somehow sweet, all over my body. Ninir's mouth and throat worked furiously, drinking all the blood flowing from my neck without missing a drop. When I dripped blood on the Skya map from my finger, it was only a visual effect without physical form. But I could feel hot, thick liquid passing through my skin. The girl's HP bar, with its 1% remaining, began to quiver. The continual damage of the silver poisoning was battling the recovery effect of her vampirism. Without the actual dragon's blood, I couldn't purify the poison in her veins. But as long as this overpowered the damage, I could buy Ninir a few more minutes, or perhaps even longer. Please, please work, I prayed, glancing briefly at my own HP bar, which was already under halfway. Obviously, there was no point if I died, so if I couldn't neutralize Ninir's poison by the time I reached 10%, Asuna or Argo would have to take my place. I hoped it wouldn't come to that. The floor trembled irregularly. Aguilar was approaching with the loss of its left wing and arm. I couldn't run normally, but it would surely reach us within 30 seconds. No, 20. I'm not going to make it in time, I lamented.
Draw its attention! Hold it back!
Shouted a rich baritone that filled the hall. I saw Agile and his companions charging towards Aguilar from the right side. They'd lost more than 30% of their HP, but there was no hint of fear in the way they brandished their two-handed weapons and struck at the dragon's legs. They must have volunteered to buy time, trusting that I had some miraculous do-or-die plan in mind. I couldn't leave them out there to die, but Ninir's HP bar still wasn't showing any signs of increasing. My HP sank under 30%, approaching 20. Was the gain from my blood perfectly equivalent to the continual damage of the poison? Even still, I couldn't just give up. At that very moment, someone grabbed my right shoulder and called out a command in a loud, determined voice.
Heal!
A pink glow surrounded my body. My HP bar, which had been close to 10%, instantly shot back to full, all the way to the right. After a brief instant of shock, I realized what had happened. Asuna used our one healing crystal, the one we'd picked up from the Viridian Lancer beetle, on me. Healing crystals had no effect on a Lord of Night, but even still, the healing power that melted into my blood seemed to confer some kind of effect to her. Rather than jittering in place back and forth, Ninir's HP bar finally just barely began to increase instead. Her mouth let go of my neck, and her hoarse voice sounded in my ear.
Thank you. I will be fine now.
Ninir had recovered a bit of color in her cheeks, and she gave me a brave smile, clearly withstanding a lot of pain.
The dragon, Kirito. You can do it.
I nodded and stood up straight, still holding Ninir around the side. Beneath my full HP bar, there was an icon I'd never seen before. It was an image of a crimson fang over a black background. I didn't need to look at my status window to know what it signified. All of a sudden, I was overcome with a strange sensation. The warmth was draining from my skin, from my insides. It wasn't chilly. It was like my body temperature itself had gone cold. Although I couldn't see myself, I was sure my skin must have gone extremely pale. there was a strange, tickling sensation inside my mouth, and my upper canine suddenly sharpened. My vision was oddly clear and crisp, allowing me a very sharp view all the way to the far end of the previously gloomy chamber. Fortunately, I wasn't struck with any sudden thoughts, like, I must have blood! That was obvious. Of course, the nerve gear could control my bodily senses, but it couldn't control my thoughts. Still, I couldn't help but be a bit relieved. I spun on my heel and handed Ninir over to Asana. My partner gave me a piercing upward gaze, but took the little girl anyway and stepped back. I sent her a look of apology, then picked the sword of Alupta up off the ground. It seemed to stick to my palm, fitting right in. I squeezed hard. The blade glowed red again. Beneath my HP bar, 3 new icons appeared. My guess was that they represented poison nullification, HP regeneration, and increased critical hit rate. The true name of the semi-translucent, obsidian-like sword was Doleful Nocturne, according to Kyo. Asana filled me in on the meaning of the words, which was something like mournful night song. As the pamphlet at the casino claimed, it gave the wielder 3 extremely powerful buffs, but at the penalty of your soul power, meaning that it absorbed your accumulated experience points. Most likely, the real name and appearance had been hidden to conceal the fact that it was a terrifyingly wicked sword. Only one kind of person could wield this sword without the downsides. A Dominus Nocte, or Lord of the Night. I opened my window just to check and did not notice my experience points going down. In other words, by allowing Ninir to suck my blood, I had also become a Lord of the Night, just like the ancient hero Falhari, who used this sword to slay the water dragon, Zakarai. Was there a way for me to turn human again? Or would I be like this forever? That was a question I didn't need to answer at the moment. As I told Ninir, this was the only way to save everyone. I didn't have an ounce of regret over my choice. I gave the sword a light swing. Now that it was taking its true form, the feeling of flimsiness I got the first time I held the weapon was gone, replaced by a hefty strength that reminded me of my old friend, the Anil Blade. With both hands on the grip, I hoisted the weapon high overhead. I wouldn't be able to activate any one-handed sword skills, but instead, "Agile, get back!" I shouted, drawing the attention of the bro squad from where they stood, keeping Aguilar occupied. They gaped at the sight of me and quickly retreated. With all my strength, I swung the sword straight down and promptly flipped my wrists to continue sideways. The brilliant red slashed formed a cross-shaped shockwave that flew forward. "Dodge that one if you can," I taunted the dragon. Aguilar's right wing extended in another attempt to slide out of the way, but the cross slash hit it right at the base of the neck, easily cutting it loose from the torso. Its long neck writhed like a great snake in the air, body and arms spinning backwards with the force of the blow. An explosion of blue flames erupted all the way to the ceiling, and Aguilar, the igneous worm's body, split into pieces.